All right, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Good morning and good afternoon to you, wherever you are in the US. Welcome to Keeping Cool, How States Are Leading on Climate Action. This is an event of Climate Week New York. And my name is Clara Summers, and I am the Climate and Energy Manager at the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, or NCEL. For those of you that don't know, NCEL is a nationwide network of more than 1,000 state legislators focused on shared learning and action. Our mission is to empower legislative champions to protect, conserve, and improve the natural and human environment. Created by and for state legislators, NCEL provides resources on environmental issues through legislative research, events, and facilitated collaboration between lawmakers working on similar issues. We are nonpartisan and non-lobby. NCEL serves as remote environmental staff to connect legislators between states and also with experts and resources on a range of issues. All of our speakers today are NCEL members, so thank you all for being here. A few quick housekeeping items for our attendees. This webinar is being recorded, and you are welcome and invited to ask questions in the chat, in the Q&A box throughout, and we will answer them during the dedicated Q&A time. For any comments, please use the chat function. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator, NCEL board member and North Carolina Representative Pricey Harrison. Representative Pricey Harrison is a Democratic member of the North Carolina House of Representatives representing District 61. She currently serves as Vice Chair of the House Environment Committee. Representative Harrison is the recipient of multiple legislative awards, including awards from the Southern Environmental Law Center, the North Carolina League of Conservation Voters, and the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association. She is also immediate past president of NCEL, of the NCEL Board of Directors. So with that, Representative Harrison, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Clara. We're glad to be here during this Climate Week to share state stories. This is a Climate Week like no other during a summer punctuated by historic hurricanes, wildfires, flooding, heat waves, and droughts in every corner of the country. This is quickly becoming our new normal, and the situation is going to get worse without concerted efforts. So in August, we all know the IPCC released a report that was quite alarming. We must fully decarbonize before 2050, and most of that work needs to get done in the next 10 years to keep us below a dangerous threshold. We know the stakes of the climate crisis, but we also know their solutions. Today, you're going to hear from a panel of distinguished state legislators who have, who have led and designing state policies this year despite the challenges of COVID. The best climate policies are policies that promote good governments and uplift marginalized communities. And the legislators with us today have led on bills that focus not just on climate change and clean energy, but also addressing systemic inequity. It's my pleasure to introduce our panel. Senator Reuven Carlyle represents Washington's 36th legislative district. He now chairs Senate's Environment, Energy, and Technology Committee. He is the lead sponsor of the historic Washington Clean Transformation Act, moving the state's electric utilities completely off coal by 2025 and 100% clean energy by 2045. Representative Alex Valdez represents House District 5. Representative Valdez is a chair of the Energy Environment Committee. He's chair of the Latino Caucus and a member of the LGBTQ Caucus. He has authored and passed laws to bolster Colorado's community solar industry, protect the public from air toxic emissions, and phase out single-use plastic bags and styrofoam products. And then Representative Pham is a state rep from Oregon House District 46. She was first elected in 2020. She's the first Vietnamese American legislator in the state legislature, and currently the only elected Asian Pacific Islander in the Oregon state government. Representative Pham was a founding leader and a spokesperson for the groundbreaking Portland Clean Energy Fund initiative, which successfully passed in November 2018. So I'm going to start with a general question for the three of you. I guess we'll go in the order in which you were introduced. So the opening question for all of our panelists: why did you select the policies that you pursued? And are there any unique features that could be applied in other states? And I guess we'll start with Senator Carlyle, please.
Thank you so much, and greetings from Seattle. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. I think for us, the last 3 years have just been historic in terms of our efforts to move towards science-based targets. So for Washington, what that means is we basically emit about 100 million metric tons of emissions. By 2050, we have to, of course, continue to grow our economy, but we have to emit 5 million metric tons. So that's the reality on the ground. That's what the science means and says. So for us, what we did is we worked really hard to tackle the 80-20 rule, which is what are the deep decarbonization opportunities in the electricity sector, the transportation sector, buildings, hydrofluorocarbons, all the others, as well as providing a broad framework of an economy-wide cap and invest carbon pricing program. So we identified both deep decarbonization opportunities within critical sectors, and we wanted to build a pricing mechanism that allowed for the decarbonization at the economy-wide level for our large emitters, over 25,000 metric tons. I think fundamentally, passing the Cap and Invest program to be second behind California allowed us the benefit of learning from their leadership and make fundamental and important structural adjustments to their program as we prepare in the coming years to get the program up and running and prepare to join California and Quebec in linkage. The fundamental transformational difference for us, I believe, in identifying this policy and this approach was to embed environmental justice and equity at the very DNA and the very core of the public policy. And that allowed us to build a coalition that was authentic and substantive. I'm very proud in our Cap and Invest bill, for example, as well as our clean fuel standard, we had a lot of support for as well as a central pillar of our transportation decarbonization. But for Cap and Invest specifically, to give you an indication of the coalition, we had the endorsement and the support of this bill from both Black Lives Matter Alliance as well as British Petroleum. So it just goes to show that we were very focused on building a coalition with environmental justice at its core. So that's sort of a high level of overview of why we targeted those particular initiatives.
Thank you, Senator Carlyle. Representative Valdez.
Well, good morning, everybody, from downtown Denver. Beautiful day. Finally, the temperature's going below the high 90s, which is, of course, abnormal and probably a result of climate change, which is why I am here as a legislator today. Really, there's been kind of this ideology of how do you thread these different pieces together, because Colorado is obviously kind of a middle state, but we're more Western in some of the environmental issues that we face. We were an oil and gas state, so we're finding our way into moving into new industries and really kind of adapting our state economy to be future ready. But when it comes to decarbonization and social justice elements, that's really kind of what the force behind my entry into politics was from the very get-go. So I represent 80216, which is the most polluted zip code in the United States. It's a former area filled with smelting operations and all sorts of hideous environmental toxic operations that have just not been mitigated. It's a low income area. It's predominantly an area inhabited by people of color. And so there really need to be this justice element, because I think when we talk about what our opportunities are, how we're going to really relate those to what's going on in the world today, people want to feel a sense of justice. They want to feel like we're making advancements for the good of the people as opposed to, the good of industry. And so since I started in the legislature in 2018, I've now passed over 30 bills that are just kind of what I call teeth in the decarbonization plan and in the plan to reduce pollutants in the air. But Colorado is unique because we don't have those underlying structures that most states have, like a robust air quality department, testing and the labs and the technicians and a lot of the toxicologists that we need to really create good foundations to build upon. So really what we're doing in Colorado is not only setting ambitious goals for decarbonization, but trying to build the structures that are going to get us there, because we have allowed ourselves to get, pretty far behind, and we have some functional reasons for that. But at the end of the day, we're going to need to build those structures. And that's really what I've been focused on, is putting the money, putting the toxicologists in place, getting the departments built out, getting fence line monitoring programs set up, and trying to establish just those functional pieces that are going to lead us down the path of really being able to make a difference. And so I hope that answers the question, but definitely we're really focused here on just making sure that we have the state structures to create a long-term solution to the environmental issues that we're facing.
Thank you, Representative Valdez. Representative Pham.
Hi, apologies, I'm calling from my car. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yes, my name is Pham. I'm the state representative for Oregon House District 46. And I should say that, these three bills that I'm going to talk about today really originated even before I started in the legislature, when I was still a community organizer working with the Oregon Just Transition Alliance, which is a statewide alliance of frontline-led organizations from across Oregon who are pushing forward a vision for a just back against and really looking at it with the intersectional lens. So when we went on a statewide listening tour in the summer of 2020, we heard from communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, low-income communities, their vision for Oregon they want to see in 2030. And people talk about this, but really invest in resilient communities. People had already been experiencing summers of wildfires that had really devastated communities, and knew that in addition to mitigating climate change, we also need to be supporting communities in adapting to the impacts that we know are already here and are in the pipeline. So for us, we wanted to tackle the climate crisis. Our first step was through a trio of bills, which included our Energy Affordability Act, Healthy Homes, which invested, energy affordability allowed our Public Utilities Commission to essentially charge a low-income rate class. Utilities can figure out a way to give discount rates for low-income Oregonians, so that in the midst of these deadly heat waves and ice storms, families don't have to choose between paying for their groceries, putting food on the table, and keeping their houses warm or cool in a heat wave. So that was one bill. The second bill was Healthy Homes, to invest $10 million in energy weatherization for low-income Oregonians, so that they can invest in sealing their home from wildfire smoke, or insulating their home to prevent moisture and a lot of asthma attacks that we're seeing because of the poor infrastructure that many Oregonians live in. That's very energy efficient and also in need of repairs. And then lastly, but definitely not least, we passed our 100% clean bill, House Bill 2021, which mandates that our electricity sector has to be 100% renewable by 2040, and sets really strong milestones to be 80% renewable by 2030 and 90% by 2035. So those are the trio of bills that we passed. And it started through listening to the community, through community organizing. And I'll talk about that more later, but in short, those are the trio of bills that we wanted to tackle, to make sure that we're not just addressing greenhouse gas emissions as an isolated case of just molecules in the sky, but really recognizing that racism, white supremacy, inequality, economic inequality are really at the heart of it, and we have to address these crises together.
Thank you for that, and I realize you're in session, so we really appreciate your squeezing this panel in. So thank you for that. So I'm going to more specifically, and I know all of you sort of touched on it, but if you want to talk a little bit more, because all of us involved in legislating know how difficult it is to bring stakeholders to the table and reach agreement and the obstacles that exist. And Senator Carlyle, you talked about BP and Black Lives Matter, but do any of you all want to talk more specifically about what stakeholders were important to have at the table and what sort of specific obstacles you encountered as you tried to move your legislation along? Senator
I'm happy to.
Oh, okay. Senator Carlyle, you want to start or?
Sure, if you want me to go. Okay, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think, again, the sort of the major policies last few years, the pillars of the 100% clean energy bill, the clean fuel standard was a real challenge. I'll talk about that for a moment. British Columbia has a clean fuel standard, our good friends in Oregon and California. So now Washington. So we've tried 3 or 4 times on the clean fuel standard, had a lot of resistance from our friends in the oil industry. It was a great deal of challenge associated with that. There was a perception among the opponents that it was an increase in cost of fuel without commensurate benefits for the transportation budget. So it really came down to the internal dynamics between the operating budget and the transportation budget, where the transportation budget, under so much pressure because of efficiency of vehicles and the transition around gas taxes, of course, was reluctant to have a climate policy. So that was a central element of the resistance for multiple years. We were able to get that incredible bill over the line because of Representative Joe Fitzgibbon and Governor Inslee's just unrelenting passion for moving that policy forward. And also, we have a lot of refining capacity in our state with 5 refineries. So from a per capita point of view, we're way up there in the top, toward the top in the country. So the point is that we think there's an opportunity for biofuels strategy driven by the aviation sector, the maritime sector, energy storage, long-haul trucking, and industrial uses. So biofuels are a central part of our long-term strategy. And politically, it was an incredible lift, but we worked hard to provide enough flexibility in the bill to make sure that we're taking the best of California, Oregon, and British Columbia. So we think we have a solid bill there. In terms of cap and invest, the carbon pricing, as folks know, has been a challenge in the country. In our state, we've had 2 public initiatives for a carbon tax, both that were defeated. The stakeholder process, I think, was critical. Again, I mentioned the outreach and engagement of disproportionately impacted communities. In our state, we have 29 federally recognized tribes, so they were a central part of this. We have a lot of tribes with experience relative to the California program, and so there was a lot of interest and engagement in that. We also have a reserve set aside associated with ensuring that as we overlay environmental justice in our state agencies' approach to all of our environmental policies with the health disparities map and all kinds of other critically important inputs, that the value proposition of how those decisions are made in investing those dollars environmental justice is simply not a department down the hall. It is integrated into the very DNA of the legislation itself, with Senator Rebecca Saldana, my colleague's passage of the Health Equities Bill, the HEAL Act. So the integration is essential. That led, we did have strong opposition from the far left associated with a strong opposition to any type of carbon pricing, feeling like that was inconsistent with meaningful climate action. But again, Washington is one of the only states in the nation with binding level commitments to science-based targets. And I think one of the critical ways that we got passage and built a coalition, everything from tribes to Black Lives Matter Alliance to the tech community associated with Microsoft and many others around cap and invest, was that we ensured that any offsets, which of course come under a lot of criticism from ProPublica and many other fabulous investigative analyses, any offsets are inside of the cap. That was the magic. That was the critical policy and political distinction. So any offsets are not above the cap, they're all still below the cap. And that allows for, whether they're effective or not, they're still in the cap. We have to emit. So without a cap, you don't actually reduce emissions. That's the central tenet of our policy. So politically, we were able to build a coalition, and that included a lot of the nonprofit entities in our state, such as the investment vehicles, the private equity markets as well, got it very engaged. So the coalition came together, led by key organizations around business, labor, communities of color, low income, and a number of others. So that was the reality of what it took.
Thank you. And I'm Representative Pham. I didn't mean to cut you off. I realized you were getting ready to speak when Senator Carlyle's light came on. So thank you. If you wanted to get more specific about this.
No worries. I understand it's hard over Zoom to see cues, and I appreciate your flexibility with my my special session situation. Yeah, I would say that you know, I do come from environmental justice organizations that have leveled some critiques about market-based solutions, including offsets and trading and carbon markets, part for many reasons, because of the disproportionate impact on frontline communities who, even if you are able to buy offsets, have to suffer the higher pollution, even if the emissions are offset elsewhere. Those communities directly impacted by the facility, the emissions, the polluting facility, still have to face higher OSBA rates. And also, I think in this moment, I was also elected on a mandate to take the climate crisis seriously, not just accepting the science of climate change, but accepting the policy solutions that are needed if we do take the science seriously. And in 2021, unfortunately, because there's been so much delay in serious climate action for decades, when we knew about it in the 80s, unfortunately, the solutions now that are actually viable are much stronger than the solutions that our fossil fuel companies like BP are willing to accept. And so I would say that in answer to this question about coalition building, we do have to be realistic and just honest about whether or not fossil fuel companies like BP are ever going to support a solution that is ultimately going to eviscerate their entire business model. I think that they are seeing the lines and the writing on the wall, and they're rebranding and trying to brand themselves as somehow renewable energy companies. But unfortunately, in this moment, we don't have time for just light price signals that nudge people. We need to actually push and mandate, and it's going to be tough. I definitely have a lot of sympathy and understand why people are really emphasizing what seems politically feasible. But I think in this moment, movements that help to elect me are saying we need to actually push what is considered politically feasible, because what is materially necessary in this moment to protect human life and all life of many species is going to require much bolder action. And so some of the coalition members included frontline communities who have been facing the brunt from the beginning, whether it's farm workers in Woodburn and Salem to Rogue Climate in Southern Oregon. It included Verde in Portland, which has done incredible work working with the Latinx community, but trying to do ductless heat pumps. But they realized we have to take this solution at a systemic level. So I was really proud to work with the incredible frontline-led alliance, the Oregon Just Transition Alliance, to make sure that we could cobble together a solution that both addressed emissions, but also addressed the jobs and investments that are needed by communities who've been on the front lines for many years.
Thank you. And Representative Valdez, I don't know if you want to add anything about all your 30 bills you've passed in the past 3 years, which I'm completely humbled by. If you want to talk more stakeholder process and and obstacles.
Yeah, I mean, here's what I'll say. The justice element, the way that I thought the most important initial step is to really allow the solutions to start with community. And as a legislator, I see my role is to really find ways to bring those concerns and those ideas through a process where you are working with stakeholders on both sides. But I think, having community be heard on what the solutions are in their mind, and then trying to adapt those to what is a very complicated system of government and stakeholding and bureaucracy, and trying to find ways to really ensure that folks are being heard. I think that's the first element when I think of the justice element that we take on when we go to make legislation. The second piece is our in Colorado, things are very incremental, which is kind of frustrating because I think we all come in with this great idea that we're going to immediately change the world and we're going to be able to change these great policies. And we look at states further west and in somewhat envious about what is possible. But what we do here is we really take bold initiatives and we have to kind of break them out into multiple pieces of legislation that we find in time come together to really create community solutions. The solutions, I think, that are really the last element of the justice side of how we legislate. A lot of folks feel isolated from those solutions. So when we talk about renewable energy as a solution for dirty energy, there's an accessibility issue that I think we have to, if we're going to be serious about the justice element, we have to find ways to bridge those gaps. When we talk about vehicle electrification, which is another opportunity in the transportation sector, there's this feeling that electric vehicles are also inaccessible. So I think, from the place of trying to find legislation that's going to really take us to the next level, it has to be accessible. It has to be built kind of from the ground up, and how we're going to find solutions for the communities that are impacted first, that then become greater change. And I think I try to look at everything I do with this lens of those folks that feel excluded. How do we change that? How do we change the conversation to ensure that people who have felt sidelined in the discussions of the solutions come to the table? And then how do we take communities' ideas and bring them into our legislation in such a way that we can make those things a reality? Because I think then people engage the government, engage the process, and see us really as a solution as opposed to politicians, which I think, I'm, speaking for myself, but I think a lot of times people think politicians are about talk and not action. I think in order to do that, we really have to show some meaningful change on the ground for community.
Well, thank you for that. And I represent, so we're going to get to specific questions directed at specific legislators. And Representative Pham, recognizing that you have to hop back into your chamber soon, I'll direct the first one to you. And you sort of talked about this in your opening remarks, but and we're facing this in North Carolina as well. In most states, utility commissions only consider reliability and overall cost when setting electricity rates. And Oregon is now able to consider disproportionate energy burden that low-income and environmental justice customers bear. I think you talked a little bit about whom you worked with and what were some of the key considerations, but if you want to elaborate more specifically, that would be great.
Yeah, and I do want to emphasize, this bill started with frontline organizations expressing the need for energy affordability as we transition to a renewable energy economy. But the coalition couldn't have happened without this huge table that included our utilities, PGE and PacifiCorp, most specifically our big investor-owned utilities, and as well as, it included the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, the Coalition of Communities of Color, Rural Organizing Project, SEIU, labor, so many different partners to help shape this bill. And it was, this was a product of several years of discussion. I don't want to say it just happened in a year, but it was really that thoughtful negotiation. I would say that the secret ingredient for all of these bills was truly making sure that we had a big stakeholder table to ensure that people could really feel that their voices were heard and incorporated in the policy development process. A lot of times frontline organizations are brought in at the end to just kind of rubber stamp or kind of like a box to check. And I think it was really critical that this table was actually convened by frontline organizations and making sure that our concerns were really centered. And we also got to develop leaders amongst all these organizations as they kind of really engaged in policy development.
I just from a personal perspective, trying to work on this exact same issue in North Carolina, how just having the coalition support is how you got to the point where you could advocate for the energy burden consideration. Folks signed off on it. I
think having utility support was really critical as well as just having. I think the key thing was that we really focused on building a statewide alliance, a truly statewide alliance. We built this Energy Justice Leadership Institute, which started out as just a 5-session institute to give people the basics of our energy system and really understanding our current energy system, distribution, transmission, and some of the challenges it brings, especially in a climate changed world, in terms of wildfires and ice storms that knocked out power for weeks in some parts of our state. And so we extended it to a part 2 so that people could continue to learn about our vision and hear from speakers about all the different aspects, because we know that energy, there's no pure simple solution, right? We have to understand the impacts of everything from pumped hydro to nuclear and renewable and solar and wind and so I think having that network of statewide advocates who could then talk to their local legislators, because a lot of times there's this perception that rural Oregonians have a different, don't have the same values as urban Oregonians. And I think we made an intentional effort to really develop leadership across the state so that our legislators from Coos County or from Klamath County could actually hear from their constituents saying, this is actually a real issue for me. Energy affordability, I mean, actually, arguably, rural Oregonians have a higher energy cost burden. And so this would offer real concrete benefits to rural constituents. And I think that was really the key, was making sure that we weren't just cultivating leadership from urban areas, but making sure that our coalition really was really representative of the entire state and really developing new leaders that our representatives could hear from. So they sent postcards, they did lobby visits, they made phone calls. It was really inspiring to see, because rural Oregon is actually very diverse, and it wasn't bilingual, and we made sure that our representatives heard from their constituents, and so that it couldn't be oversimplified as a rural versus urban issue.
That's great. Thank you. So I'll turn to you, Senator Carlyle. I think you touched on this a bit in your remarks, but Washington State's Cap and Invest program is part of a slew of state policies that have been advanced in the past few years. Can you talk about how Cap and Invest interacts with the state's emissions reductions targets and environmental justice requirements?
Ultimately, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're at about 100 million metric tons, and by 2050, we have to be at 5 million metric tons. Following the 80-20 rule, if you look at the large sectors like electricity, energy sector, transportation, the only way we are going to achieve our emission targets and to get to a Paris Agreement level emission reductions is to have an economy-wide pricing mechanism with firm, absolute, and declining caps. Without that, it's just virtually impossible to meet Paris Agreement level reductions. So for us, there was, we have a very small Democratic majority in the state Senate. So it was a very substantial challenge politically. The House was in no way a guarantee either. So building the coalition that we talked about earlier, and that is central to all of this work, was embedded in. I think ultimately the tribes played a critical role in our state and sort of essential to that success. But the legislation, in terms of identifying the value proposition of it, accounts for about 25 to 30 million metric tons. So of the 100 million metric tons, 95 million metric ton reduction that we need to achieve, the Cap and Invest program is close to 30 million of that, just that one bill, that one policy. So it goes to show you that the 125 largest emitters in our state, whether it's Alcoa, Kaiser, Boeing, Weyerhaeuser, all of the different large emitters, some of them, or many of them in disproportionately impacted communities, we have in effect learned from our good friends in California, and we built in belts and suspenders so that if there is an increase in emissions in a given area, that in effect that facility, that plant, that manufacturing facility can be deemed ineligible for the Cap and Invest program, and there's just a straight regulatory model that takes effect. And that was an important lesson from California. And that combined with making sure that any offsets, which again are only 6 to 8% of the entire emission reduction. So what that means is, in effect, 92 to 94% of the emission reductions have to be comprehensive and system-wide from the large emitters. So the technical elements of it, I think we got the benefit of improving on California, the benefit of learning from best practices out of the European Union, the solid caps that allow us to reach science-based targets by 2050 and wind down is a central piece of it. That's a best practice from around the world that's taking effect. And also recognizing that I think that California had some elements of their program that we could improve upon that helps California make improvements to their system. And that's the benefit of going 8 years after California. So it's not as scary or terrifying or politically difficult as some may believe. I think bringing in labor and jobs as the next generation of clean jobs was a critical piece of it as well.
Oh, thank you for that. And Representative Valdez, buildings constitute more than 70% of electricity and 29% of gas consumption. Colorado is one of the first states to pass a building performance standard. Based on your experience designing this legislation, what would you say to other states interested in doing something similar?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it was a great opportunity to really understand how you can go sector by sector and really address carbonization. I think one of the things that a lot of folks don't understand is kind of the interplex that commercial spaces have in this overall picture of carbon. So what we did is we took a program that was in place in Denver, that has been in place in Denver for many years. It's actually working. And it's kind of what I would call a peer pressure model, where you really start with just saying, publicize your energy usage if your square footage is over 50,000 square feet. That allows the market to really put pressure on building owners and operators to make significant changes in order to make their properties attractive to businesses. And so it worked pretty well in Denver. We thought this is something that we need to implement on a statewide basis, because obviously Denver is not the entire state of Colorado. We have other cities that we thought, could bring this along. And then you have to put, like I said, you have to start with a goal in Colorado. It seems like this is our model, and then kind of piece by piece start adding mandates, because they're hard to do. We have this home rule situation. We have so many different things that make it difficult for the state to achieve great mandates. And we get really jealous. I'll say that again. We get jealous of the Californias and those places, because we really have to look at things in an innovative way to dodge some of the constitutional elements that we have. So the building decarbonization bill really starts initially with just saying, we need to get this information out there. And we think that that's going to be the first driver. The second is that we start to have reduction milestones that need to be met down the road. We want to see buildings reducing their energy usage, reducing their gas usage, reducing their reliance on fossil fuels for heating and other things. So by putting those pieces in place, and by really starting with this kind of, let's get the information out there so business can make a decision, we feel that the private sector is going to make a great impact, like they have here in Denver, by saying, if we're going to, use 50,000 square feet or greater for our operation, we need to ensure that we're looking at our bottom line and finding a space that's going to save us money, and one that we can also, I think the pressure from employee groups and just individuals is they want to see their employers do better. And so it's just one way to kind of get there. I think when we look at building codes in Colorado, we don't have a statewide building code. We don't have a framework of a statewide building code. Every single jurisdiction in Colorado has its own building code. And so it's just this hodgepodge, but how do you bring it together? How do you create a piece of legislation that's going to get the whole state started? And that start really is get it out there, and then start to work in these milestones that are pretty easy to achieve, especially when you talk about common area lighting and things like that, to reduce usage, to reduce reliance on fossil fuels, and really to graduate our spaces to that next level. And I think that, when I do conferences or when I do webinars like this, it's really interesting to hear what's going on in other states, but it's also like, man, I wish we could do that. I wish we could take on, cap and trade or the different things that are going on nationwide, but we really have to do things differently in Colorado. And I think there's a number of states that would probably run into that same thing, whether there's partisan divides that are in the way, or whether there are things like home rule, where all of your localities are like their own little state. So you have to be creative. You have to look at what the opportunities are, and in a lot of ways, you have to go to programs that are already in place that have shown that they are effective, and try and expand them.
Well, thank you for that. I certainly know the feeling coming from a very British state. So to any and all of you all, what should the federal government learn from states on climate action? Who wants to go?
I'll go.
Okay, thank you, Representative Valdez.
We need the federal government to lead in kind of the larger areas of policy. I think one of the things that's on our side as environmentalists and as environmental legislators is that one thing big business hates, oil and gas and other emitting businesses, they hate patchwork regulation. It's more expensive for them. So we need federal action. We need federal action to set standards and then allow the individual states to take those basic standards and build upon them for their constituencies, because obviously Washington, California, Colorado are going to be a lot more open to moving to bolder action. But we need a baseline, because without a baseline, we don't have the support of industry. We don't have kind of a place to build from. So I really believe that, like the senator said, or we're behind. We're very far behind, and we need the federal government to do that rapid catch-up element to get us to a baseline where we as legislators can really innovate for our states, because we have different issues. I was at a conference, an environmental conference recently, where I was talking about water, and one of the other legislators was like, water is a regional issue. It's not interesting to us. So we really do have to get to a point where our federal delegations are setting the baseline and allowing us to really approach the individualized challenges that we face as states. And so I'm very hopeful that we'll see some action there, because it's becoming expensive to deal with the consequences. And if nothing else, that might move people. But I'm very hopeful that we can find bipartisan solutions, because I think, like NCL, like everything, there is a bipartisan effort to really stem the damage that's being done, and to maybe even just save money or create more longevity for their business models. It's gonna bring people to the table. So
Thank you for that, Senator Carlyle. Representative Pham, y'all want to add anything? Senator Carlyle?
Sure, I was just letting the representative go first.
Okay.
Look, I think the federal government is essential, but they can't pass a bill to decide what to have for lunch on some level. And yes, we need them engaged and invested, and yes, it's critical baseline, but states have a moral obligation to lead. We have to envision a sustainable future. Of course, there's a perception among some folks that the West Coast states, are lopsided politically. In our state, we have a relatively modest Democratic majority in both chambers. That's only been in the last couple of years. So all of this legislation on our side has been in the last few years only, and it's been very, very close, 25-24 type of votes on some of these bills. So I do have a deep appreciation and sensitivity. We also are the #1 trade-dependent state in the country. So energy-intensive trade-exposed industry sectors and others are critically important. We, of course, have a high-tech industry, which is major players relative to Microsoft, Amazon, Starbucks, Boeing, and others, and they have interests. But I think ultimately having the courage to tackle the systems issues of building an equitable approach to decarbonizing our economy means aviation, maritime, energy storage, research and development. It means all of these really tough sectors. And that means global supply chains, for example, of what companies and organizations are facing worldwide. So an 80-20 rule, a deep decarbonization of electricity, 100% clean energy. We have hydro here in our state, but those last 20% is tough, of course. Integrating wind, hydro, and solar along arguably with nuclear means a modern grid. We've got to take these federal dollars and invest it in modernizing our grid so we can move toward distributed systems like community solar and others. as well as electrification of transportation. So to me, the federal government is, of course, to all of us, it's important and it's critical, but we need them to take a stand on the weather and not be afraid of their own shadow here relative to examples like hydrofluorocarbons. Someone in the chat asked about some of the tougher southern states. What can we do? I think things like hydrofluorocarbons, which are growing international standards, are important. But again, I do appreciate very much those federal standards. They are critical. We need them. Our hope in some of the states is to affect that baseline so that the baseline actually gets calibrated in a responsible way at the national level, as opposed to settling, too low. And that's what climate action it means. It's a yes and on every single level, local, state, federal, and international.
Thank you for that. Representative Pham, do you want to add anything? I know you've got to get back into your chamber.
Thank you. Yeah, I echo the need for a strong baseline to support states. I would say that the federal government needs to do the same thing I think that state governments need to do in terms of being able to have a strong analysis about what are going to be effective solutions in this moment, and really helping to the public to understand the difference between false promises as well as actual what the kind of regulations that we need in this moment. I think that people are really waking up to the deadly impacts of climate change and the really disproportionate impacts on low income and BIPOC communities and rural communities. And I think there's a desire for action, but it's easy to get to let our urgency lead us to want to believe what's it called? All of the above strategy, just like let's throw everything at it. And I think it's really important that the federal government actually help us to understand to avoid some of the false promises of certain solutions, like I would argue nuclear, and making sure that we know that each community actually each state actually does have its particular conditions, that it knows best on how to tackle resilience, because it's not just about green, carbon molecules in the sky. It's about really building real resilient communities that are able to survive and thrive amongst the really the changing environment that's already taking so many lives today. So we really have to take a deeper intersectional look at the challenges that we face. And I hope that all of our state governments can really work together to make sure we deepen that analysis.
I appreciate that. And this responding also to the chat in there, coming from a red-ish state, we have the governor's mansion is held by a Democrat, but we recognize that we need some federal leadership. We need a federal floor. There are states that aren't going to do this on their own. So there is a partnership there. So I appreciate all these comments and all y'all's good work. I'm going to let Clara manage the question and answers now. Turn it over to you, Clara.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to pass the ball back to you just because I would love to hear more in response to Senator Heidi Campbell's question from Tennessee about what's feasible in hyper-partisan contexts on climate. I know you have a lot of thoughts on that, and then I saw Senator Carlyle had some suggestions too. So it's an open question to the panel, but starting with Representative Harrison.
Sure, and I was going to speak about this in the opening remarks, but I wanted to hear the panel speak first. So coming from North Carolina, which we managed to pass a renewable energy standard back when the Democrats were in control in the last decade or prior to 2010. But after 2010, we made a pretty dramatic shift like a lot of states did. What has happened is that we have managed to build bipartisan support for the economic impact of renewable energy, more specifically solar. Right now, we're number 2 in the country in installed solar capacity, number 2 or 3. We go back and forth. So that initially jump started by our renewable energy standard. And then there's just a lot of, I guess, a favorable business climate, low taxes, quality of life that North Carolina provides. There was a strong interest in the industry to move down here. So when I worked on our renewable energy standard, we had 2,500 renewable energy jobs in 2006, 7. Around there. And then now we have about 120,000 renewable energy jobs. And we recognize that most of those can't be outsourced. And a lot of what we've been able to achieve is, I mean, like energy efficiency, such Representative Valdez has worked on, the energy efficiency standards have definitely created an incentive for homegrown jobs that can't be outsourced. And that has, there's been a real explosive growth in that area, for a mandate for energy efficiency, but it's taken a while, but because of the way the renewable energy portfolio standard was enacted in North Carolina, we had set asides for swine and poultry. So we got the buy-in from agriculture, really big swine industry down here. I think we're number 1 or 2 in the country. So that helped. Can't really talk about climate change too much, but you can talk about jobs, and that's what we've done, and that's how we managed to do it in North Carolina. And our governor has exercised all of his executive authority in enacting an order that is a climate order that requires 100% reduction by 2050, 70% by 2030. I don't know that we're going to get there, and we're working right now on a bipartisan bill on multi-year rate making and also more solar incentives. So I think our legislators come around because they have to. We have to work together. We're not deep red like Tennessee, but we were there for a while. But we were still able to get clean energy bills passed because of the economic impact, and it's been significant and tangible.
Thank you, Representative Harrison. Senator Carlyle, you had a point about HFCs that could be doable in other states. I just want to give you an opportunity to expand on that.
Sure. I just was raising that in response to the chat question about what are some opportunities in deep red states. And to me, hydrofluorocarbons, because they of course are so potent on the climate, the emission reductions associated with hydrofluorocarbon standards, modernizing those standards led by California and now Washington. The national, the feds are looking closely at this, and of course, international standards are aggressively moving forward. The challenge and the opportunity is that it requires a lot of retrofit and sort of new refrigerators for the big energy, the Walmarts and the Costcos and others of the world, and smaller providers. But companies like Honeywell and others who make those next generation systems are strong supporters of those bills. And there's a strong alliance with the community college system and the workforce development side and the job side of it that Pricey was talking about. So there's a powerful message about the next generation of jobs associated with hydrofluorocarbons. It's consistent with local, state, international standards around the country and world that are evolving. I'm not trivializing the lift, but I am saying that it's the kind of example that shows that meaningful climate bills don't have to be anti-business and don't have to be terrifying for folks. Just using that as one sort of symbolic example of a potential agenda item.
Thank you. Representative Valdez, I don't know if you also wanted to comment on the point about what's doable in a hyper-partisan environment.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I think that Rep. Harrison really, hit the nail on the head when she said you really have to focus on economic arguments. I think right now we are at a point where there's a lot of government stimulus, a lot of transformative money out there. And that's a unique opportunity for legislators to direct that into modernization, because one of the issues we have, the senator was talking about just some of these older HFC producing elements. We can modernize using fundings that we have in the short term. It creates economic opportunity in communities, and it creates jobs, frankly. So when we look at how we frame legislation that we know is going to run into trouble, because we also have it's not even just partisan, it's really where you're from. What is the industry of your town? We have folks on both sides of the aisle that have power plants that are primary employers in their communities. So you really have to focus on what are the elements, what are the immediate opportunities to take once in a lifetime transformative money that's being put out there because of COVID to modernize these communities and to really return long-term benefit to the operators of the things that are both inefficient and in need of repair. And that's where government can really step in and say, we can help with that. We can help you modernize your equipment. We can help you modernize your fleet. And doing things like that, I think, are very pro-business, but also very pro-decarbonization. So I think that that's kind of the low-hanging fruit when we talk about, and what I've always hoped is that these issues would become less and less partisan as the crisis got worse. While that's not exactly true yet, I think the economic sensibilities remain so that we can work together to really frame these major changes as investing into community, investing into business, and saying it's good for business, it's good to save, efficiency is good, and that's why government should have a role in helping business and communities to get there.
Thank you all. I want to recognize that Representative Pham had to jump off, return to Oregon special session. And being mindful of the time, there are so many good questions in the Q&A. I encourage folks to respond to them through typed message if you can, but otherwise, to be mindful of everyone's time, I will turn it back to Representative Harrison to close us out.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks everybody for being on, and thanks to our colleagues for participating today. We know the states are laboratories of democracy, advancing climate policies, and we think the federal government should follow our lead. And climate legislation can go hand in hand with good governance, good governance systems, and also addressing systemic inequity, as you have heard today. And if you're a state legislator and you're not a member of NCEL, I strongly encourage you to join NCEL. You can find it on the web, and join, please. It's free, and we need like-minded folks to join us. It's very nonpartisan. So thank you, and thanks for allowing me to participate.